What's poppin', everybody? This is the cartoon kid Ray Rollins, and for today's cartoon review, I'm gonna be talking about South Park, Season 8, Episode 10, called Preschool. Now, before I start breaking this episode down, y'all know what I gotta do. I gotta give y'all that episode breakdown. Most South Park fans already know what this episode's about, but for those who don't, this episode centers around Stan, Cartman, Kyle, and Kenny, and even Butters in a sense, all dealing with a colossal problem. And that problem is their schoolmate, or well, former schoolmate I suppose you can say, Trent Boyett, has been released from juvenile hall. Now normally, this wouldn't be a problem, but the reason why it is a problem is because the boys essentially put Trent Boyett there in juvenile hall. Because while in preschool, the kids wanted to play a game called Fireman, which is pretty self-explanatory. But instead of putting out a fake fire, they wanted to put out a real fire. And since Trent Boyett is one of the toughest, meanest, evilest kids in school, they knew that Trent Boyett had the ability to start a fire. The boys convinced Trent to start a fire. To make a long story short, the fire ends up spreading, and the teacher, Miss Claridge, tries to put the fire out. She ends up getting set on fire and essentially burned alive. As the paramedics are getting Miss Claridge to the hospital, the police officers ask the kids, "Yo, Trent says you started the fire. Is that true?" And they say, No, we're good kids. Trent started the fire." And this ends up getting Trent Boyett locked up for 5 years. And throughout the entirety of this episode, Trent is trying to get his revenge and retribution on all the boys involved in that incident. So there you go. That has been a nice summary of the entire episode. Brief, quick, to the point. Now let's get into my first initial thoughts of this episode. Although this isn't a series that I review much on this channel, my brother and I loved South Park as a kid. And I want to say I saw this episode when it initially came out. Granted, I could be wrong, but I'm thinking the episode came out in probably like 2004, 2005. But if it didn't come out there, that's when I seen the episode. I had to be like 8 or 9 years old. Me and my brother always used to sneak and watch South Park as kids, man. And this, alongside The Simpsons, had to be one of my favorite cartoon series as a child. I shouldn't have been watching it, but you know how those things go, man. When I saw this episode for the first time as a kid, I enjoyed it a lot. Primarily because it was a darker episode of South Park. Granted, South Park isn't known for being a fun, funny, lighthearted series. I mean, well, it is fun, it is funny, I guess you could say. And at times it can be lighthearted. But this was a more serious issue being tackled here in this episode. A very serious issue. And another episode that I could think that kind of goes along the same route is the episode where the kids end up getting their semen stuck in Miss Chokes on Dick, you know, the 4th grade teacher. And she ends up dying as a result of that. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I don't remember that episode specifically off the top of my head, but I do remember it was a dark episode. The kids thought they were gonna go down for murder, and it was just something that was different. It was something that wasn't normal for South Park, at least when I was watching it at that time. This is a more darker, serious episode where the kids are dealing with a very serious problem that could have dire consequences. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on in my review portion of the video, but that was my first initial thoughts. That's why I really did like this episode as a child, and that's why I kind of like this episode a lot more now as an adult. But with this episode being so dark, man, comedy definitely played a huge part in the enjoyability of this episode because it's South Park, man. You can't have any South Park episode without any form of comedy, right? And the main portions of the comedy come in when the kids are trying to find protection against Trent Boyett. The first hilarious situation goes down with Butters and his parents. Butters hears about Trent Boyett getting out of prison, or juvie, I guess you could say, and he essentially goes home to hide. He's hiding in his room in the dark, and his dad tells him, he's like, "Yo, you can't be a hermit all your life, man. Go outside and play." And Butters' dad, as you guys know if you are true South Park fans, and even if you aren't, Butters' dad is very hard on him. He is a jerk. And you can kind of say he's very verbally abusive to the little Butters homie. So he essentially throws Butters out of the house, locks the door behind them, and expects Butters to play. He doesn't know that Butters is afraid of Trent Boyett. They don't know anything about Trent Boyett. But essentially, Trent comes up to Butters. He sees Butters across from the street, and he says, you know what? All right, it's time to get some revenge. So Trent crosses the street and approaches Butters. Butters is freaking out, pounding, beating on the door. Let me in, let me in. And Butters' parents are so cold, man. His dad's just reading the newspaper, and his mom's just sitting listening to him beat on the door, practically begging for his life to be let in. And the dad's just tuning him out, and his mom essentially says, man, I can't listen to this. I'm going to go upstairs. And that's what she does. And Trent ends up fucking Butters up. Now, if that wasn't comedic enough for that entire situation, when Butters is at the hospital, it is revealed that Trent Boyett put this dude through the ringer. He ends up hitting him with damn near every bully move you can imagine, from snoogies, wedgies, a noogie, and something called a Polish bike ride, which I might have to look up on Urban Dictionary to see if it's a real thing. I'm sure it is. Trent did all this amongst other things. And this is when the boys really realized that, man, this dude's insane. We really need some help against this man. And this is where they go to seek out help from the 6th graders. So when they approach the 6th graders, Cartman essentially offers them Dr. Pepper, a Harry Potter movie, and then something else that's really not important. 6th graders say, no, man, we don't want this shit. We want a picture of Stan Marsh's mom's breasts. And you know, the boys being 4th graders, they don't know about that stuff yet. They're not old enough to know about that stuff. So they want to appease the 6th graders, so they try to end up getting a picture of Stan's mom's boobs. To make this long story short, instead of giving them a picture of boobs, they end up decking Cartman's butt cheeks out to look like boobs. They hit him with the whole nipples. They put the nipples on there and everything. Take some pictures of that and hand it off to the 6th graders, who are surprisingly fooled by them. Little do they know, they're getting hot over Cartman's ass cheeks that are, decorated to look like Stan's mom's boobs. And each of the unknowing 6th graders takes the boobs, or what they think are boobs, into the bushes to do their business with them. And I just love how here in the episode, the kids are like, man, are we going to be like that when we get older? And they're all like, nah, no we're not. So they appease the 6th graders, and they think everything is going to be all right. But Trent Boyett ends up fucking up the 6th graders too. He hits them with a whole list of bully moves as being explained by the doctor, and he gives them something called the Texas Chili Bowl, I believe it's called, right? Where the doctor says, I don't know what this is, but it involves Tabasco sauce, a telephone, and the anus. All right, use your imagination. Just the funny little comedic parts of this episode, man, are hilarious to me. But going on to the final comedic part of this episode, after realizing that they can't get help from the 6th graders and that they're essentially backed into a corner, Stan has to go to his sister, Shelly, and ask her for help. As most South Park fans know, their brother-sister dynamic is very screwed up. Shelly always beats up Stan, belittles him, just shits on him in general, man. And this situation is no different. She doesn't hit him, surprisingly, but she just ends up hollering at him, essentially making him beg for her help. So as Stan's there crying, you see her just walk up to him and just holler in his face, causing him to jump and all that good stuff. And she essentially tells him that, yo, you know what? If you guys want me to protect you guys, you have to tell Miss Claridge what you did. Stop running from your past and tell the truth. Own up for what you did. This is why you guys are in this predicament to begin with. Which undoubtedly is the entire lesson of the episode. Now, after the incident, poor old Miss Claridge ends up essentially becoming a robot. And she has to live her whole life as a machine, essentially. And she's only able to communicate through beeps and whatnot, 1 beep for yes, 2 beeps for no. And in this episode, Miss Clarence ends up getting stuck in the middle of the crosswalk of the street because her whole machine died. Since that's her only way of mobility, she can't move and she can't speak. She's just stuck there. And there's plenty of good old comedic moments that go on with this, sadly, but this also plays a big role in the ending of the episode, because when the kids go to confess what they've done to Miss Clarence, Trent Boyett ends up confronting them. This is where the whole final confrontation ensues. Trent goes to give the kids the beat down that they've been deserving for the past 5 years when he was in juvie. But Cartman ends up threatening him with his mom's taser. Trent doesn't think that he knows how to use it, which he obviously doesn't. He attempts to tase good old Trent. But the taser ends up misfiring and restarting Miss Clarence's machine, which ends up causing a whole onslaught of chaos and destruction. And the police end up showing up again, accusing Trent of trying to take out his old preschool teacher. Unfortunately for Trent, the kids didn't learn their whole lesson from Shelly, and they decide to stick to their old ways of keeping themselves out of trouble and tossing it on good old Trent. The police even asked Miss Clarence, hey, did Trent do this? And she beeped twice, which originally supposed to mean no. But one of the officers said, oh, that means yes, yes. Lock him up, boys. And Trent is going back to juvie. Now, if that wasn't funny enough, Cartman ends up laughing at him and even mooning him and showing him his boob booty. And, you know, see Trent's facial expression at the end of the episode, and it's pretty comedic, man. But all in all, my final thoughts of this episode are pretty positive. I can't say anything negative about this bad boy. One thing that I do appreciate about not only an episode, but even a series, is an antagonist that everyone can get behind. Trent Boyett's motives of revenge are really understandable, you know. We don't know too much about how he really was in preschool. We see that little scene of him beating up one of the kids, telling him to say uncle and all that. Yeah, he's a jerk, but I'm pretty sure no one deserves to spend 5 years in juvenile hall as a kid for something they really didn't do. All Trent did was start a fire, which, I mean, inadvertently did lead to Miss Clarence getting messed up like she did. But it was the kid's fault why that ended up happening, not Trent's, essentially. And it could be argued, I guess, but the main reason why Trent was mad at the kids was because they didn't own up to what they did. And even at the end of the episode, they still couldn't own up to what they did, and that's why Trent's going back to juvenile hall again for probably another 5 years. I don't know about you guys, but I can definitely understand Trent's frustration and why he wanted to beat the kids up so bad. I totally can get it, and that's one of the things that makes this episode so great. As I was explaining in this video, the comedy of this episode was on par. With it being a serious episode that it was very, I guess you could say, relieving to have all the little jokes tossed throughout this episode. To me, it made a good mix of serious content and comedic content throughout this episode, and it fits so well together. But the number one thing that I really did enjoy about this episode was the fact that these characters, every single one of them, were all believable, man. I'm sure that none of us, probably some of us maybe, but I know I haven't been in a situation as serious as Stan, Cartman, Kyle, and Kenny with the whole Trent Boyett situation. These 4 boys, well, 5, you gotta add Butters in there too. Only thing they cared about is what normal kids care about, and that's just the present moment, man. They want to play, they want to have a good time. They're not worried about anything too serious. And the number one thing about kids is when they get into trouble, they're always willing to toss that blame onto someone else. Granted, this is a very serious situation, and it's kind of understandable why they want to toss the blame off on Trent. But I just loved how in the 2 instances, the first being preschool, once Trent took the blame for that situation, and even at the end of this episode here, when they realized that Trent was going to take the fall once again, they were so happy because they realized that they got away with it and that they're not going to have to take ownership of the stuff that they've done. And that alone made this episode very enjoyable to me, man. You see these kids trying to figure out a way to not only deal with Trent Boyett, but to keep their secret of what really happened that day in preschool. All in all, the serious nature of this episode, along with the good comedy tossed throughout it, as well as the believable characters, man, made this a fantastic, enjoyable episode for me now, and as well as when I was a child. This was all in all a very good, enjoyable watch. So I'm going to have to hit this joint with at least maybe an 8.5, but you know what? I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. This was very enjoyable to me. And whenever I see this bad boy pop on Comedy Central, I always sit down and give it a watch. It's just enjoyable, man. It's one of those episodes where you see it on TV, you're like, oh man, I gotta watch this. Especially if you're an OG South Park fan like I am. I haven't been watching it too much recently. I've been trying to get back into it. But I've always enjoyed South Park for what it was. A nice, funny, adult cartoon series that from time to time gets into the craps on real world situations. But I especially love the episodes where they center around the kids dealing with real world problems that a normal kid would deal with. Like, bullying is a big thing nowadays in the world, man, and most kids do have bullies to deal with. I may be going overboard by saying this, but I truly do think this episode is a masterpiece. Very enjoyable. But once again, my rating for this episode is an 8 out of 10. This has been my review for South Park Season 8, Episode 10, Preschool. This is the Cartoon Kid, Ray Rollins. Tell me what you think of this episode, man. Tell me if you liked it. Tell me if you hate it. Tell me what you would rate it. Toss all your opinions and suggestions for future shows and episodes down in the comments box below. That's what it's there for. And as I always say at the end of each video, I love y'all, and I'll see y'all when I see y'all. Peace out, everybody.